Good evening, Peter Goertz. I want to talk about Holocaust survivors, and my background is three-quarters Jewish, and my grandmother was in a concentration camp, and she survived. And in Germany at the time, after the liberation of the camps, things were very chaotic after the war, and people were just walking miles and miles and miles from different parts of the country to other parts, and even from out of the country to Germany. So she actually walked home from the concentration camp. She'd lived in Germany previously, and she actually never talked to me about that. And it seemed like she was doing okay as far as her life. She just pretty much, it seemed, carried on where she'd left off prior to going to the concentration camp. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who'd been in Auschwitz and written about it. And one example that really stuck in my mind is that he saw another inmate in the midst of a nightmare, and he reached his hand out to touch the inmate, and then he realized, oh my God, the nightmare is probably still better than the reality in Auschwitz. So that really tells you something. I've seen concentration camp survivors during my work as a psychiatrist, but also outside of work. And I remember one particular lady in her mid-80s at the time, and she was sitting on the edge of her seat, and she seemed like she was expecting to be hit at any time, still many years after the concentration camp experience. So she seemed quite fearful, very alert, and by that time she already had some cognitive deficits, but was still very tense. And she'd been in a concentration camp in Poland. In contrast to her, I once met a gentleman who'd been in a concentration camp outside of work. And when I saw him, he'd actually been in what they call a death camp. So one of the camps in eastern Poland that were called death camps because essentially people went there to be killed. Whereas, for instance, in Auschwitz, some people worked and some people were killed. So he went to that camp, but when I saw him, he was leaning back on a sofa, shirt open, and he seemed very at ease and comfortable. And I wondered many times after I met him, what was the difference? What made the difference between him, the way he acted, and the way that lady acted, who was on the edge of her seat, looking like she felt like she was about to be hit? And what came to me then was, as a potential reason, that this gentleman had actually fought against the Germans in the Warsaw Ghetto with weapons. There had been people in the Warsaw Ghetto who'd fought with weapons against the Germans. And after the war, he became a very successful businessman, was very wealthy. And like I mentioned, he came across as very confident when I met him. So I'm wondering if standing up for himself as a fighter against the Germans might have helped him to be like he was, as opposed to the lady who was sitting on the edge of her seat and seemed very afraid still. So, as we know, standing up for oneself can be empowering, and that gentleman might have been an example of that. And the lady seemed to be, and like I said, she already had some cognitive deficits when I saw her. She seemed to be living to a large extent in the past, thinking about the events that happened to her. and due to that, maybe feeling like a victim. Whereas the gentleman seemed to be very much in the present and had done many things since being in the concentration camp, and had, it sounded like, focused on the present moment as much or quite a bit since he left the camp. Thank you very much.